You're listening to a social justice podcast hosted by NICOLA SPURLING, brought to you by The Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book. Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING, and today I'm joined by Mo Amir and Ian Bushfield. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks.
Oh yeah, it's a pleasure.
Mo, can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Mo Amir. I am the creator and host of This is Vancolour, which is now a television show on Tsłuch, a regional TV station here in BC. And basically, I talk to people. I do my own political commentary on the show, and I also do a bit of commentary for CBC as well.
Wonderful. And Ian, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Ian Bushfield. I am the co-host of the Politicoast BC Politics podcast that I've been doing since 2017, and the Canby Report podcast that we've been doing since 2018 that covers Vancouver and Metro Vancouver politics. Those are my hobbies that are most relevant for today, but I have a very broad web presence with a very very specific name. I think your name's a bit more generic, Mo.
Yeah, there's a comedian named Mo Amir as well, but he spells Amir A-M-E-R. But I like that. I like that you have to work a little bit to find me online.
A little different than the Justin McElroy
a little bit different, yeah. But I should say Ian is like an OG of like Vancouver area political podcasting. He was one of the first to do it. So you should put that label as well.
Well, that's how I know you, because I ran for politics in BC and you had me on Politicoast.
Yeah, we did a panel. I think we had you... who else was on that?
It was your live...
It was one of our live events.
50th or 100th? That?
I don't know. I've lost count. We're at like 370 episodes of Politicoast. We do weekly. It's a lot. Wow. I have to go record one after this too.
Jeez. That must be a lot of work. Today, just so the audience is aware, we're going to be talking about commentating or alternative media. So I want to start off by just providing a definition of journalism, because I want to set the stage for how that differs from what we're talking about. So journalism is the work of collecting, writing, and publishing news stories and articles in newspapers and magazines, or broadcasting them on radio and television. And in my efforts to research stories and bring attention to them, I've sort of struggled with how to refer to myself. Am I a journalist? Am I a reporter? Am I a commentator? I've had police ask me to prove that I'm a member of the press in order to work on investigative stories. And I also don't want to take away from people who've gone to school and who do this full time. So I find myself needing to sort of stand up for our right to freedom of the press in Canada, and also not use labels that are going to take away from what, professional journalists are doing. So I want to get into how you both refer to yourselves. Are you commentators? Do you have other names that you use for yourselves?
On Canby Report, my co-host Matthew really likes to say we're like the premier citizen journalists covering Metro Vancouver. And I like that phrase, but I also don't always feel 100% comfortable with it, because a lot of the stuff we cover is secondhand, right? It's secondary coverage. So we aren't generally breaking stories. We have done a little bit through FOIs and digging into reports and things like that, but 90% of the time I'm relying on hard work of people who have trained to tell stories really well, and then I just kind of repeat my thoughts on that. So I don't know, I call myself a podcaster when it comes to these shows, at least.
Right. Yeah. How about you?
Natural. Yeah. I guess I was probably, or I would have called myself a podcaster when I started, but then as things evolved, like talk show host, I guess, because it is being broadcast on television, and then commentator because I am on the radio. I shy away from the journalist label as well, because it's like, was Oprah a journalist? I mean, she was a talk show host. Is Joe Rogan a journalist? I mean, he's a talk show host, right, in a sense. And like you, I'm not really doing primary beat reporting, right? So I'm also doing secondary reporting. As much as like I have quote unquote broken stories, or people have done secondary stories on stuff that's happened on my program, I don't see myself, certainly not as a reporter, but yeah, I think talk show host, commentator, opinionist.
Well, how did you get into your podcast? How did Vancolour start? Like, were you talking about stuff before? Because before I started my podcast, I was doing blogging when I was in like undergrad and stuff. Yeah. But then, there was the like mid 2010s or late 2010s when that started to go downhill, and I just kind of got out of it.
Yeah, fair enough. I started it on a whim, but I got my master's degree in political science at SFU, so always very involved in, or at least somewhat informed or interested in politics. I had done some volunteer work for a riding association. Don't ask me which one, because I don't want to say. But I always had interest in it. Had a certain base knowledge. And also, during my undergrad and graduate degree, wrote a lot for the school paper. So did kind of different roles there. Again, not beat reporting, but was in the humor section for a bit, did features, and some columns as well. So it was kind of a mismatch of things.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I think, you've both been doing this a lot longer than I have as far as commentating on various things, because for me, it was more of I ran for politics before I ever got into commentating on politics. And it was more a result of I'm seeing so many issues in the process of running for politics that when I'm not running, I feel like someone needs to bring light to this, right? And so I try to focus on stories that other people aren't focusing on. I don't want to be like the person who's just taking other people's work and trying to make that my own and make a name for myself that way.
And I think that's the beauty of social media, right? It's kind of democratized, for better or worse, the media landscape. And so all three of us were able to kind of enter the space through non-traditional channels and carve out our own spaces. And I think that's a great thing, because that it, I do think that media watches it to a sense. I know they certainly follow.
I've been told people in the Premier's office listen to my show, which is always a little weird to think about.
I've heard that as well. And it's weird when you have staff members of a party quoting back stuff that happened or to you, and you're like, oh yeah, I forgot about that or whatever. But it's cool, right? But we also are kind of in the Wild West of, I mean, not so much me anymore, but if you're just podcasting or quote unquote independent, you can do whatever you want. Right? There's no one really setting rules or guidelines, so it's whatever you want it to be in a sense. And I kind of, certainly before I started working with more traditional media, was also in that realm of okay, I'm just going to do things within what I want to do, but I have my own sort of sets of principles and what I'll cover and what I won't cover, and we'll just see what happens. And so that it's beautiful in a sense, but then it creates a lot of potential for things like misinformation and disinformation as well.
Right. Yeah, there has to be a certain amount of ethics involved in commentating, whether you're traditional media or alternative media. And do you see that there's still avenues for people to get into media through traditional methods? Because it seems like everyone's losing their job in the media these days.
It's a tough question for us, since neither of us have those traditional jobs. I mean, I know a lot of people who've tried to get into journalism or who have been journalists. By the nature of talking about this stuff, you end up following them, and eventually you meet a few in person. And there are people who are really lucky to have the press gallery jobs and are pretty secure in that. But then, we've seen startups like the OMG Media kind of went through a big wave with Capital Daily, I think was their big publication out in Victoria. And that kind of is still around, but isn't the dream it was a couple of years ago. There's some other startups that are doing well, but some of their journalists move off and look for better salaries. And I don't know, no one's getting into journalism to be rich these days.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really key point, especially here in Vancouver, where the cost of living is so high. And so oftentimes you'll get very ambitious, very talented people getting into the business, and then they hit a certain point in their life where they're like, yeah, I can't make this little amount of money, I have to do something else. And they usually get swallowed up in comms jobs. I'm not saying it's a bad thing that people are hiring these folks, but it's the reality is that communications or professional communications has swallowed up a lot of talented journalists or people that would have been great. And it's just where the industry's at. There's just not that much money there. And it's sad. And so that's where I think the role of citizen journalists or people doing it independently, they're kind of filling that void, for better or worse.
It almost seems like it's becoming more of a hobby than a career. A lot of people I talk to who are commentating on issues, they have a main job, and then they do, a podcast on the side or something along those lines.
Still work for my family business 3 to 4 days a week. So yeah, I juggle multiple jobs, despite being employed by at least 2 outlets. But those are not full time either, right? So
yeah, and I mean, I've been hired by CBC to come on 1 day a week. It definitely doesn't pay the bills, right? It's great, and I'm glad that they're paying people to come on when they do. But it's really difficult to make a career out of it, it sounds like.
I mean, one of the challenges I've heard is in these smaller markets where you're working for a Black Press or a Glacier Media kind of paper, you're one of 2 reporters if you're lucky, but then you are covering so many stories that you never have the chance to really get into it. You're not making a lot of money, so the working conditions aren't great. And that's where, you have to pump out so much content that none of it is in depth, and the stories end up just being like regurgitated press releases often. And it's not like the journalist's fault, just because they don't have the capacity to, get into something as much as they'd want to. So.
And if you're a TV reporter, you're doing everything. Like you're hauling your own camera, you're setting it up, you're doing the shot or whatever. Like I've heard that story as well, of just people cramming a bunch of jobs together that used to be done by separate people. Plus you add social media on top of that, where it's like, oh yeah, and also we want you to on social media all the time and be active on there. So
but don't get in trouble.
But also, don't pop off, which is, you know what, that's a fair request. But
a challenge though sometimes.
Yeah, sure, it can be. But it is, they're just burdened with a lot of rules today, certainly more rules than they were 30 years ago.
And the media landscape in Canada is changing over the last 15 years. We've seen a massive rise in social media, and that's increased distribution networks for information, both true and false information. We've also had a decline in print media. We've talked about that, massive layoffs in media workspaces. So how do you see alternative media playing a role in that new landscape? And how do you see safeguards being implemented in order to protect society from a spread of misinformation?
I mean, there's a lot of really great startups that are out there that are either just fully independent, like, I don't know, the Discourse is on the Vancouver Island. There's a bunch of kind of like progressive groups. The Tyie's been around for a while, and they've done always great work. And then there's even like kind of partisan affiliated ones, like Press Progress is affiliated with the Broadbent Institute that's broadly NDP aligned. And so like you'll never see a critical story in there of the NDP, but like the stories they write are pretty good, very well done. Like no one's ever taken Press Progress to task over facts because they don't get it wrong. They do their hard work. Now, you don't get a full picture with that kind of situation, and a lot of these startups have to focus on environment or like one or two issues, so you're not getting a full rounded view of everything. I mean, one thing that's been really fun with Cambie Report is that it's actually really easy to cover municipal politics because the personalities are like, everything's smaller. Like you can meet these people. Like I'm booking a meeting to talk with the mayor of New West and just have like an extended interview with them. And, I could probably, when we covered the 2018 municipal election, we had each of the mayoral candidates like in my bedroom to interview. It was like Ken Sim came in that election and sat on my couch. And we talked to him for an hour, and Kennedy Stewart was there for an hour. And like, that was really cool. And you could have that. But I was also doing it off the side of a desk and as a volunteer. And so it was more like I couldn't get into the stories as deep, and the questions were probably a little more superficial than, someone with a deep institutional knowledge could bring to them.
That's a good point.
And it's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think the importance of local news and community news cannot be overstated. We need reporters in every community, and I think there's certainly people coming out of J School that would love to do that as well, or love to get their start there. When it comes to independent media, a lot of people want to get into independent media and make it big and get all the clicks, but you're not going to really do that if you're covering, the District of North Vancouver. And so when we see a lot of independent media creators, they want to cover stuff that's national or that has relevance to a larger audience. And so they're not really focusing on a lot of quote unquote community news. Maybe they will focus on something in their community and try to broaden it out. I mean, that's kind of what I was doing in a sense as well. But one of the things that really troubles me is like, that's where a big base of our news comes from, is local reporters in communities breaking stories. And we just have less and less of them and less resources for them. So it becomes a challenge. And again, as I just said, like, it's great that alternative media is kind of filling some voids, but they're, for the large part, just going for the big views. And so they're not really interested in municipal politics in the same way as a community paper would be. In terms of rules and guidelines, like, it would be great to say like, oh, if when you start YouTubing or TikToking commentary, there's a guideline you can work off of, but that doesn't exist either. So you're kind of just making it up as you go and learning as you go and hoping you don't fall into, a trap where no one wants to talk to you.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's especially true of local journalism, that you can't get that information out to your audiences very easily. Like whenever I cover local news stories, which is what I'm particularly passionate about, I either have to create some super sensationalist title for what I'm putting out there, or it has to be in the midst of an election period when people are actually paying attention to those types of things. And I want to talk about that sensationalist aspect because I think that's always been around in the media. We've had eye-catching headlines in newspapers, overhyped television broadcasts, but these days, if you don't have that eye-catching title, if you don't have a wild thumbnail or captivating storytelling right at the beginning of a video, the chances are you're not going to get seen in a saturated social media space. So in a world of clickbait, how do you maintain strong principles, ethics, and morals with regard to the information that you're putting out there?
I think I've just not been concerned with the clicks as hard. Like, it's nice to have the audience, but it's always just been like a passion project for me. So it's like people have found us somehow, and, you know, we get a couple hundred or 1,000 views or listens an episode, and that's kind of sufficient because we have a core dedicated base who spreads it a little bit by word of mouth. But I mean, that trend is so tempting though, right? Because you look at, take Rebel News, for example, and like, I'm not going to just pick on them because a lot do this, but you can see it very well in their model where they'll take a story, use that sensationalist headline, and there's like 3 fundraising calls in the middle of that story because it's the same thing the political parties will do. It's like drive rage, people get mad, and then they will donate. And like, sometimes I have to do this in my work, you know, because I work for a nonprofit that's activist. You know, you have to get people feeling something, so they'll open your wallet so you can keep your lights on. And it's a dangerous circle where you need to make sure you are tethered to reality and facts and science and evidence and compassion and all of those good things I believe in. But we can see what happens when you don't tether yourselves to those.
In slight contrast to Ian, like, I've fallen into that spiral, but you do, I think you're correct in that you do have to be tethered to reality, right? Because in a way, any story, no matter how it's done, has to answer the central question of why should the reader care, right? Why is this important? And I've always kind of grounded myself in that. And yeah, there's not only a temptation, but I think a propensity to lean into something that's sensational. Where I try to maybe moderate that a little bit is asking a question, right? Does the carbon tax actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? That's an interesting question to me. If I saw that, I'd be like, yeah, does it? Then I would, you know, try to stick around. Like, is that sensational? Even though the answer is probably a lot more nuanced than I think people would like. Like, you're not going to get a yes or no necessarily answer on that. In one hand, you do want to entice people. You do want to explain to them very quickly, because everyone has a short attention span, why they should care. But on the other hand, you don't want to be a clown show, right? You don't want to be a circus.
Yeah.
That's just like, you know, hitting your senses and rage baiting. But I think one technique that I've always used is just asking a central question that I think people might be interested in.
Well, one thing I know you told me when I had you on Politicoast a couple months back is you said you were really good at keeping a network of friends and non-political, like being tethered to the world and making sure you checked in your opinions with people outside of your little bubble. And I know, especially post-COVID, like, I don't get out much. And it's not like intentional. It's just like, I have work to do at my computer at home. Then my kids come home and it's like, oh, that's my life 80% of the time. But
that's like, and to be completely honest, that is my focus group for a lot of how, not just how I form my opinions, but just what I see people are interested in at the moment, right? Is just talking to people that I know are not political nerds like all three of us, and just asking them, like, what do you think about this? And again, it's not that I take their opinion. It's just a gauge of like how they see things. And that, I think, does keep me grounded, because one of the issues I've seen in media, and I'm not being critical of anyone specifically, it's just a general observation, is sometimes political media talks over your head. Like, it's like this inside circle that likes to talk to each other and they all get it. But if you're just an outsider coming in, you can get lost. And I remember even being, again, studying, you know, having a graduate degree in political science, watching political panels and being like, I can't understand 50% of what they're talking about. Like, no one's explaining this for me. And so my format has always been leaning into explaining things for people so that if you know nothing about a subject, you can still take away the gist of like what the issue is. And I think, you know, especially for politics, I think we need a lot of that, because what people get instead is just some sloganeering from politicians.
And not a lot of people pay attention to politics outside of elections, so they probably need that really basic explainer too.
Totally, yeah. And so I try to do that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to make sure that you talk to people that are not engaged in the issues and see what they think about certain things. And oftentimes I'll also find that people are pretty malleable, or they're pretty reasonable. So even someone who might vote conservative or whatever, but if you explain something to them, you know, you can see kind of the wheels turning and they go, oh yeah, okay, like I kind of get that. And I think most people generally outside of Twitter are very reasonable and willing to hear different opinions.
And I want to come back to that piece around asking a question as a way of sort of engaging people. I've tried to use that myself recently in a story I was doing about politicians and their opinions of trans people. And my question that I posed was, do BC politicians hate trans people? Right? Which is a little bit sensationalist, probably creates more division than it needs to. And I only left that title up for about a week before I changed it because I was sending that video out to those politicians.
Exactly. It's not you changing that. No.
But what are your thoughts on, like, can you push those questions too far? I guess is the question.
Yeah, of course.
Mr. Polyev, will you deny eating babies?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's like it's like framing something like, is the prime minister a secret trans person pushing a trans agenda? Like, for some people, that's sensational clickbait because they hate the prime minister, so they'll click and be like, I want them to say yes. And usually they don't say yes, they just kind of imply yes and something like that. But a better question would be, is the prime minister in substance advancing human rights for trans people? That's an interesting question to me. And I think for a reasonable audience, maybe that is an interesting question, right? Like, let's cut through all the sloganeering and all that stuff. Let's actually see what he's done. So like the question that you asked, that would be maybe one step too far for me.
Yeah.
But I've had headlines where it's like, you know, is the mayor of Vancouver gaslighting the public on this? And I think in my mind, it was fair because in the segment, we talked about the mayor saying one thing, but the reality on the ground being something completely different. So it's hard, right? Like there's a lot of gray.
Yeah, and you can justify it depending on how you're interpreting it. Like in my mind, I justified that question, and then it wasn't until I sent that video out to the politicians that I went, well, they're not going to interpret this very well, so maybe I should change this. And the problem is, as soon as I changed it, the analytics dropped and no one was paying attention to it. So there has to be some sort of way of capturing people's attention without being so sensationalist that you're creating division or creating more problems than you're solving.
Well, and I think that's the trap of so much social media right now, is all of these algorithms driving attention requires, like, it came out in multiple different stories that Facebook promoted, like, stories where people did angry reacts more than reacts. So it's, some of it's a bit active, and maybe there's a room for government regulation to be like, hey, stop that. And not just like the ham-fisted regulation we've seen where they're like, hey, just give the media a bunch of money because you're linking to them. We don't need to debate that policy fully, but like that decision by Meta to shut down news access has definitely been harmful to Canadians. Yeah. Even though like it's dumb. Every side on that I've been really angry at. And especially because only the big media are getting money out of it, right? The algorithms are bad, social media companies are bad, the government hasn't done anything very effective.
No, you're right. Like, and I understand it's more complicated than the example I'm going to use, but there was an active campaign for tobacco companies to stop marketing cigarettes to kids, right? Like, government has exercised the capacity to create certain rules around certain products. And, you know, is there a reality where the government can step in and say, listen, like, these algorithms cannot be programmed to just have people fighting on the internet all the time. I think there's the capacity, but the government doesn't have the knowledge of, and no one has the knowledge of, like, how those algorithms work and how you're able to change them.
We're so far behind technology.
Yeah, and is a fight on the internet, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or whatever, is that an organic debate, or is that the algorithm really incentivizing people to engage in that type of behavior, which we're all, you know, on some level, we can all fall prey to, right? Like, I don't think you can't say like, I've never freaked out, not freaked out, but like I've never done something I haven't regretted in terms of an interaction with someone on the internet. So there is a government role, but it's really hard. Like, I don't know when only a select few people truly understand how those algorithms work, how are you able to police them?
Right. So when it comes to the rules around legacy or traditional media and alternative media, how this could be, you know, legal rules, or it could be personal rules that you have for yourselves. How are you applying that to the work that you're doing? Or what?
Yeah.
I guess what are those rules and how are you applying them?
Legally, there's the obvious things of libel and defamation law that exists, and it's rare that that comes out. But most people who get into the space realize you can't just straight up lie about other people and like knowingly try to tear people down with lies. But then there's a lot of gray area, right? And especially with the rise of misinformation, just like active disinformation sites where they're like, what if we do just lie for clickbait? And maybe we're funded to do that. But, you know, let's take people who are trying to be in good faith. You know, some of the basic principles of journalism are really self-policed. They're set out by, there are journalist standard organizations and the Canadian Association of Journalists and things like that, but none of us are members of that. But the idea of making sure you hear both sides, give both sides an opportunity to comment if you're seeking out commentary. A lot of the time I don't. Usually I'm just doing secondhand reporting, or I have found that when I interview politicians, especially provincial or higher level, it's such a waste of my time because they are very good at not answering questions. And so I'm like, I don't do it as much as I used to in some of the early days of the podcast. And like you hear it, if you hear an interview with Justin Trudeau, he can walk circles, or Pierre Poilievre could walk circles around us or talk circles around us. But if you're, you know, doing a story on political fundraising, maybe you got to send for a comment from the city and about that. Or I put in a comment because I'm looking at the City of Vancouver's transparency on freedom of information requests and like how many are they charging for that. And so I asked the city for a comment. I haven't done anything with that yet, but that kind of fairness and making sure you're not just like one-siding a story.
And are there certain instances where you wouldn't get the second side? Like the second side is so ridiculously off base that it's not worth getting a comment from them?
I probably haven't covered those stories. Or if I do, it's just like, I'm just spouting opinion, in which case, you know, I'll be aware of what it is said. But
yeah, I mean, libel and defamation and not lying are definitely the big ones, right? Like it has to come from a truthful place. It has to come from a place where it's not just tearing someone down for the sake of tearing them down. And, you know, the rules that I keep for that is like, because I use a lot of humor and elements of humor as well. I don't make fun of people's physical appearance or health. Obviously, if they're wearing something ridiculous or something that looks out of place, like I might tweet about it, but I'm not going to do a full commentary about it or anything. But certainly stay away from that. Stay away from invoking, like general name calling, unless it serves a purpose, unless the joke serves a purpose to the commentary. Like, you know, people's like, oh, you name called Pierre Poilievre. I just called him a landlord, but I said it in a tone. But it's true. Like, he's a landlord. And
right.
So, you know, is that name calling? I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, I guess my tone made it an insult or whatever, but it's just fact. So not name calling, don't invoke people's families. You know, I'm not telling people to vote one way or the other for the most part. Like, certainly I lean a little bit to the left. I'm probably more of a centrist than I let on, but while leaning left, like I'm not really telling people you have to vote for this person or definitely don't vote for this person. But I've certainly asked in the past, you know, is this person fit for public office? And I think that's a fair question and a fair opinion to have.
And that could be the case for someone on the left or the right.
Totally. Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Every party has had to let someone go who's just not a right fit.
Yeah.
Let's leave it at that.
And then in terms of both siding, like it becomes difficult when you're a talk show or an opinionist, and I'm both. And so I afford anyone that I talk about, certainly in commentary, to come on and give their side. I've had people that I disagree with or people whose actions or words I've slammed on my show or on the radio and I talked to them as well. And so, you know, is that both siding things or is that just being fair? I just see it as an element of fairness, right? Because if you're criticizing someone's policies, if you're saying that their plan won't work, then you have to be able to give them the opportunity to use your platform to explain their side. But again, I have boundaries of who I will talk to, right? And so I will not talk to Nazis, like actual, you know, like people who profess that they're on the alt-right. But I probably have a little more tolerance to talk to people who are, you know, far more conservative. And I get a lot of flack online when I have a John Rustad on or an Aaron Gunn on the show. And I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that. It depends obviously on what you're talking about. I think would I talk about trans rights with someone who isn't trans? No. Because also I don't feel comfortable necessarily defending it because I'm not well versed in that subject, right? So there's some things I can debate, sure, but I think you just have to pick your spots and recognize that if you're going to be critical of anyone, you have to be, certainly in my position, you have to be ready to platform them as well and give them the opportunity to speak within certain limits, right? Yeah. Like if I say Nazis are terrible, I'm not going to have a Nazi on the show to explain why they're not.
Right. And this is where I think a lot of criticism of Joe Rogan comes into play, right? Is the people that he's choosing to, I guess in people's minds, platform, right? There's a difference between bringing someone on the show to give them a platform to talk about whatever it is that they want to talk about, and bringing someone on the show to have a conversation about a specific issue, maybe with someone else who has a different opinion, and challenging them on the things that they're saying.
Yeah, and I didn't get that. I think with Rogan, he's not a journalist. Like he's not, I don't think he should be held necessarily to that standard. He's had some people that I would not talk to, but you know, that's his show. He can have on whoever he wants, and he has no particular accountability to, or no responsibility to hold people accountable. You might say that, oh, because of his platform being so big, he does. But does he? Like, he's just a guy that talks to other people.
I mean, in my mind, it's not sort of like a rules situation as it is. I wouldn't personally do some of the things that he does because it doesn't fit with my ethics and my morals. That's not to say he shouldn't have the opportunity to do that.
That's what I'm saying. Is like, I wouldn't necessarily do that, but should he be barred from doing that? I don't know. Like, I don't think so.
Yeah, I think the bigger critique comes in for platforms like Spotify that give him a whole bunch of money. We should call them out for being like, why are you supporting this asshole?
Right.
Like, there's much better talent out there who tell much more interesting and valuable stories. But kind of this shape of the system we live under, if we want to call it capitalism, pushes for these kind of views, I guess,
but
right?
Do you ever get mad at grocery stores for carrying the National Enquirer? Like...
No, I'm going to say it's not a new issue, right? Yeah. Like we went, the previous media era where newspapers were great was one where they were responsible to advertisers, and like that was where their interest lied. So there was like a shape of discourse that was allowed within newspapers, and it still exists today, right? Like the Globe and Mail is out being like, this capital gains tax is too high, and it's like, it's not going to affect your readers. It's affecting 40,000 people in Canada. So like your class interests are showing, and you go back far enough, and it's always been shaping the discourse in that way. And so money talks, and it finds its way to constrain us. So I'm on the board of the BC Civil Liberties Association. I'm not here to give their position, but I clearly care about press freedom. And like, I'm with you, Mo, like there's not really a place for government to say like, you can't have a podcast, but you can, or something like that. And what's been great about podcasts and the internet is we can all start these shows pretty cheap. Like, you know, you have a good setup here with your mics and your camera, and I spent a couple $100 on mine. But you can get into a podcast with your phone and like the internet for very cheap. And you can get a decent podcast for like a couple $100.
No, it's very true. Yeah, it becomes difficult in terms of like, who do you talk to? How many perspectives do you have? I generally go by the rule of it's best to have multiple perspectives on something. It's one that I wish I did a little more of, but again, you're limited with the amount of time you have per episode or per week or whatever. But in terms of platforming different perspectives, I try to do that. And again, if it's a perspective that I disagree with, I try to push back. And even when it's a perspective I do agree with, I try to ask the counterbalance. I usually cite someone else. I say, well, this person said this, like, are they wrong? Or, you know, how do you square that circle? So I think the idea of, again, within certain limits, different perspectives is always good.
Well, and I think one thing podcasts have let each of us do is avoid that trap of false balance.
Yeah.
Of saying like, well, there's two opinions, so we got to just go, here they both are. No, like we all take opinions very strongly on our shows. And I think that's a valuable thing to our listeners. And it's why there has been a growth in these kind of alternative perspectives and alternative shows, is because people want to hear something true and compassion, and that they can see themselves reflected in.
Exactly. It's funny. That's actually my fallback excuse when anyone's like, oh, you lean too much this side. And I say what I often point to, and it's not really an excuse, but it is it's a perspective that I have, is if most of the media is reporting a story this way, but I feel like there's a perspective being missed, I want to have that other perspective on. Right. And I think that, again, what's the value of both siding it for me if I'm just going, listen, I want to have alternative perspectives, or I want something that cuts against the grain of the status, quote unquote, status quo.
I also find myself having to take that second side a lot of the time because I'm agreeing so much with my guest. Like, the people who come on my podcast are typically people that want to talk about social issues. They care about social issues. They're not the ones playing devil's advocate here, right? So I need to be the one playing devil's advocate, and I need to go, well, these are the questions that people out in the real world are going to be asking about this subject. It doesn't mean that I agree with that side of things, but I think the audience is going to be curious to know what your response to that is going to be.
Totally, yeah. And I think in some ways, I mean, if we're going back to the politics side, it's like that is the role of opposition parties is, yes, once an election comes around, they have to have a platform that explains what they're going to do. But when you're in the legislature or parliament, you have to be somewhat of an antagonist and question everything, even if you agree with it, because you want the government to be able to explain to the public why they're doing something. And it should be the same way with police officers as well. We put a lot of trust inherently in police officers. We give them guns to be able to enforce the laws, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be allowed to question them. And it doesn't mean that we're anti-police, but it just means that we're asking for accountability. And even if it's something we agree with, having them explain the decisions that they make. And
I mean, maybe we're a bit anti-police. Some of us.
I'm just talking about myself. Listen,
Yeah.
I'm not. Well, you know, I think they have a role in our society, but it's funny because I've gone down that route of questioning or asking for accountability, and then everyone's like, "You're a defund the police guy," and I'm like, I've never said that or espoused that view ever. But we live in such a polarized world where it's like even going to that alternative of asking like, hey, should the police actually have the power to do this, suddenly makes you anti-police.
The mildest of criticisms of
Yeah.
power.
Well, I think this is maybe, I was going to bring this up later on, but this is a chance to talk about my own personal experiences with our local police department, because when I was running in politics in 2020, I was running for the BC Green Party, and I had a transphobic individual dox me, and I tried to get the police involved because at the time I thought maybe they can do something to help me. Well, they just came over and said, if you want to be in politics, you have to deal with that. And like, that's, no one has to deal with being doxxed, right? So I've been critical of the police for that, but I've not found much of an audience that's sympathetic to that, right? People don't like others who are critical of the police. And in the process of sort of investigating what happened, it's about a 3-year investigation at this point into sort of what happened, the police response to my complaints about this, I've exposed a whole bunch of different things. And part of that work has involved going to my local detachment and recording my conversations with people, recording at the police detachment. They have a sign at the detachment saying, no recording. I've challenged it. They've threatened to trespass me. They've asked me for ID to prove that I'm a journalist. And I've had to say, we have freedom of press in this country, right? Anyone can go in and do that. And to prove that point, I had a press pass printed up, and my ID number is 007, and you know the date that I started being a journalist is birth, and the date that my press pass expires is death. And you know, I've used queer colors because I've gone, well, if Rebel News can create this very like right-wing version, I'll do the very left-wing version of that.
The point is, you're not trying to impersonate someone. You're letting them in on the
right.
Yeah.
But what I did is I posted a picture of that press pass online and said, hey, take a look at my new official press pass.
That went divisive, didn't it?
It got very divisive. And so I'm really curious to know your thoughts on that. Like, there is, in my opinion, no such thing as an unofficial press pass because, like I mentioned, we all have freedom of press. But we also talked earlier about the difference between what we do and what like a mainstream media journalist would do. And is that taking away from what they do, or is that me just standing up for freedom of press?
I think it's both, actually. Like, I know a lot of journalists. I read some of the comments on your threads, and like some of the journalists made really good points, right? They, you know, pointed out that, you know, they went to J school, they have full-time jobs, and they have a responsibility. And like, if they do their journalism bad, there are consequences for them professionally and economically. And like, if they do a really bad story, they might never work again. And so I get where they're coming from, for sure. But I also get, like, legally, there's no such thing as a journalist.
Right.
And, like, don't quote me on that. I haven't studied the freedom of the press law as much as I have, like, freedom of religion, which I know intimately in this country. But I'm pretty sure you could get away with that. Like, they don't have the right to shut you down for coming and saying and filming outside a police station. That's nonsense. That's utter nonsense on their half. So, like, I fully respect what you did, but I also get why people were mad at you for doing it, right?
Yeah.
So I probably wouldn't have done it, but I like that you did it. Like, there are situations where there are press passes that do exist, like different conferences will accredit journalists who they approve to
You
come.
can get more access. Yeah.
The different legislatures have press galleries, and there have been controversies over people trying to get into those or not. And often those are self-policed, and that's how they get away with it. So it's like the mainstream media will say, all right, well, we'll allow someone from Global, all the newspapers, but you, Mo, you just run a podcast. You can't be in the press gallery.
I would never want to be.
Yeah.
It sounds terrible.
It sounds like they have good drinks and a lot of like buddy fun.
And that's where you get into criticisms of, who is making those decisions and how are they motivated, right? You don't want to get into a position of a government saying we're going to exclude media that's critical of us because, that's censorship of the press, right? Yeah. So there's obviously a line somewhere there. It's not entirely clear where it is.
So I can only recall one moment where I had like a somewhat of a serious press pass, but the other press passes I've gotten have been for like Van Expo, which is the Comic-Con.
Yeah.
And we weren't covering it. They just offered it to us. And so, me and my crew went. They didn't even bring their camera. I was like, we're not doing a segment here unless we have booked interviews. And they said, oh, maybe you'll get an interview. And I said, well, we're not going to spend a whole day trying to get, an interview of this star from this show that I haven't seen. And that star is probably pretty big in some communities, but it's just not speaking to me, or it doesn't really speak to the show. So, I've had a lot of press passes like that. It's just kind of a thing that someone decides, like, yeah, you should have one. I did have a press pass to the BC Liberal Leadership Convention in 2022. And yeah, we recorded, we filmed. I talked to some people. I was definitely the more offbeat media person there, but it was fun and it was great, and they were very welcoming. I think it all depends, right? And I think I do kind of sympathize with those journalists in a sense. I mean, the police thing is slightly different because I agree that you should be able to film there. But yeah, if it's like some sort of conference and they get to decide who's there and who's not, it is up to them, right? Like if it's a private club or political party, like they do get to decide who gets to cover it.
Well, like the press gallery is such a fascinating creature for me because like it exists and I get that it's independent of government, but it still faces such structural issues, right? Like this is the social justice podcast. We have to acknowledge that our media is overwhelmingly white and male and old.
Well, the press gallery particularly is very white.
Yeah.
Please forgive me if I exclude someone, but I think Mira Baines might be the only person of color on the press gallery.
In BC? Yeah, there have been in the past a few others, but there's never been that many.
CTV's Binder.
Binder Sajan.
But not many. Right?
Yeah.
Not many other people of color. I think that then skews what's reported.
Yeah.
In a sense. There's inherent bias. And again, you'll never get perfect representation, but you can certainly get better representation than just one person of color.
Well, like, as I mentioned, covering municipal politics is so much easier. Like I was at Kennedy Stewart's announcement that he was going to run for mayor. And I think I asked a question there being like, hey, are you running because Mario Canseco included your name in a poll and you did well? I kind of caught him off guard because I think it was true.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was weird asking that question because I'm like, I just have a podcast. Do I get to ask a question here? And like at a few of the other things, I sat with the other journalists like Dan Fumano and Jen St. Dennis. Fantastic people covering the city of Vancouver. Absolute gems of journalists. So good at their jobs, but not enough of them. But yeah, like I could be part of the club at municipal politics, but I couldn't walk into the press gallery in the BC legislature. They have security and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I bring a more diverse presence either, but a different perspective, I hope.
The reality is like, and this is part of the problem with representation in trying to get it perfect.
Yeah.
Things are finite. You can only have so many people in the room. You can only have so many words that are printed. And so this idea that you're going to get perfect representation is not possible, but I don't think it makes it a fool's errand to try to strive for different perspectives or strive to have a press corps, literally set aside the press gallery, but just like a press corps that has different experiences that speak to different communities in this province, right?
Different priorities, different lived experiences, everything.
And again, I'm not trying to slam the press gallery. Yeah. I don't know what the divide is, but would it make sense to have like someone who came from a more rural background in the press gallery as well? I don't know if they have one. Maybe they do. But like, that makes sense to me. Like, that's another type of diversity. It's not just about race necessarily, but there's different ways you can look at it. And I think that's all important, but we also do have to recognize there's just a finite amount of seats that are there. A finite amount of people who could actually do that job as well, in fairness.
Yeah. So you both recently discussed the MNP scandal on your respective platforms. And without Chase Barber of Edison Motors bringing information to light via TikTok, who knows if that massive scandal would have been exposed. And I think that points to the fact that TikTok seems to have become a massive platform for media or for news to be shared, particularly as platforms like you mentioned, like Facebook, have restricted access to news. So what role do you think social media platforms need to play in regulating or deregulating mainstream or alternative media? Now, you've talked about potentially regulating how algorithms work. Are there other ways that you could see that happening?
I mean, we're seeing right now this attempt, it just passed through the US Congress, and Canada's being asked if we're going to do the same to like force the sale of TikTok to American companies. And they're like, we're not going to do that. And then they're like, we'll ban you entirely. And there's been talk of banning TikTok for years. And some of it is based on real concerns about how these algorithms promote harmful content, eating disordered stuff. But I don't think any of those concerns are unique to TikTok. Plenty of them on Instagram that are problematic.
It's more like the Chinese influence.
Yeah, that's what seems like drives a lot of it. And I've never been fully convinced of that, because if we're concerned about privacy and security on these apps, then there's a lot we could do within our existing laws that doesn't have to pick on, where the nation of origin is. But, you could require data servers in North America. And I'm pretty sure TikTok even has data servers in North America. Like, that app doesn't work in China. They have a different app that they run. And so there's different laws we could do and regulations around that. BC was actually really interesting, because we were bringing in a let the government sue anyone who does something harmful law. And they said it was going to be mostly about social media. But you read the text of the act, and it was like, if your business harmed the public health as determined by the government, in a way determined by the government, they can sue you for damages as determined by the government. I thought it was based as hell, but for some reason, business got scared, and they yelled at the government, and finally they came to an agreement that they're going to pause that legislation, which was sad. But that's not probably the best way, because the courts are very slow, and so I don't have the best solution, but...
You don't think there's like an avenue for self-regulation among social media companies? I
think that's what the federal government is trying to do with some encouragement around its online harms bill. And I've seen a lot of actually positive takes on that from people who were very critical of this government in the past. There's still nuance to be played out. And it seems like the government is actually listening for a change to experts and being willing to amend it a bit around having like a best practice code of conduct, and trying to make sure like specific kinds of harm, including like eating disorders, but also election disinformation and some very obvious stuff, is just rooted out. But TBD how well that works, or even if it makes it to law.
Yeah, I mean, this question is difficult, right? Because I think you can talk about, okay, you can try to regulate parameters for the algorithm, which again, most people do not understand. And there's only I think they said like a dozen people in the world that maybe understand how these algorithms actually work. So setting the algorithms aside, there's obviously the issue of privacy and what's done with your data, how it's collected, what is done with that. I think there can be regulations around that. I think certainly when it comes to elections, there can be some regulation around political advertising, which we've already seen Meta and other platforms put into place, that you have to register when you do political advertising. Ultimately, though, if you are someone that has insane takes, should you be allowed to post them on the internet? Yeah, but I think there should be a very robust legal system around that, so that if you do defame someone, if you do harass someone, if you do dox someone, all that stuff, law enforcement, unlike the case that you personally experienced, law enforcement is able to step in and say, hey, this is criminal harassment. You're not allowed to give out someone's address or constantly, vilify or defame someone on TikTok or whatever. So I kind of see that stuff as things that should be built around social media, because those apps will always evolve and there'll be new apps, but I think you have to have sort of a fortress around it where it does put it to the individual that there are consequences if you do certain things on social media apps. Certainly if you commit a crime on Facebook and you Facebook Live they're not going after Facebook, they're going after the person that committed the crime, right? So I think in the cases of harassment, there just needs to be stronger laws and they need to be enforced, certainly in a more robust way. But again, can you ban someone from saying that the earth is flat on TikTok? I don't know. Like, I don't think you should. Yeah. Obviously I don't think that person is correct, but the reason why flat earth took off is because of social media.
Right.
Do we ban that now? I don't know.
I feel like a lot of it boils down to you have freedom of expression. I mean, other than breaking the law, you can put whatever you want on social media. That doesn't mean you're going to be free from consequences for that, right? Your employers might go, well, we don't like what you said on there, and so we're not going to hire you. And there was just recently these posts that I've been seeing on, I think, Threads primarily, where people have been talking about the fact that transphobic individuals will say, well, if I see pronouns on a resume, I'm not hiring that person. And that's clearly discrimination based on our current laws. But then you'll have trans people going, well, if I see that someone is, gender critical or transphobic, I'm not going to hire them. And I go, well, I mean, that's just a smart business decision.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, certainly if it's a role that's a public facing role, I mean, that's a very smart business decision not to not have someone like that. I think politicians, people in the media, and the general public needs to have a better way to differentiate criticism from harassment. Criticism can also be unfair and unfounded. But there is a difference between criticism and harassment. And the way I would say it is that harassment is often very dehumanizing or threatening. And so if you are denying someone's existence, I mean, I would call that dehumanizing. So, I would say that, transphobia is certainly harassment, whereas saying that you're not going to hire a transphobic person is criticism, and in my mind, fair criticism. Because I see that online all the time. Even people that get piled on, but oftentimes it's just people having light fun or dunking on them. Yeah, that sucks. I get it. But that's not harassment necessarily. Right?
Well, and that's the tough part with social media is it's so easy for things to spiral out of control where it's like a bunch of soft comments that aren't like on their own. None of them are objectionable. Like they might be rude or whatever. But then, oh, I turned on my phone and I have 2,000 notifications. I don't feel good today. It's how it would come across. And
which I think...
And that's a challenge with these apps, right?
Totally. And I think, an example of that is some of these politicians in BC that we've seen face consequences for things they've said and done, whether it's Jane Thornthwaite, Celine Robinson, Sanjeev Gandhi. Like, they faced a lot of criticism and a lot of it was very fair. But then they also faced a lot of abuse. And so we should be able to separate out the two. But just because there's a pylon of criticism, I agree, it sucks. It's not a great feeling. But how do you police that?
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not going into the realm of harassment. If it's just people saying, we think what you said is wrong, you should resign. Like, we're going to outlaw that? Like, I don't...
Yeah, that's a slippery slope. I don't say slippery slope.
Yeah, it's also like a big difference if it's, a cabinet minister versus like some random schmuck who just said something dumb on the internet.
Totally.
And like, I think it does get overblown. Like, there aren't that many schmucks who get piled on. No. They exist.
Everyone
and that is an issue.
Bring up the Justine Sacco.
Bring up the same 3 examples. Hey, this woman got on a plane one time after saying something really dumb.
Yeah.
And then she lost her job. And it's like, yeah, that story sucks.
Yeah, and that's extreme.
What else happened?
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And you'll hear people say, oh, my boss got mad at me because I posted this thing on Facebook or whatever. And it's like, yeah, I get it. You're in a public-facing job. They should be mad at you. And also, it's also just taking personal responsibility in the sense of this is a public sphere. Social media is a public sphere. And so you are accountable for what you say, and you're not always going to get positive feedback. It could be, people will post photos of their dog and have, like, if they're a big account on TikTok or Twitter, and people will be like, that's an ugly dog. Like, pretty rude. Yeah. Pretty awful thing to say to someone. But
they're allowed to say it.
Yeah, like, we're going to police that now? Like,
I do appreciate we keep dead naming Twitter. because it's not a person, it's a corporation. And so we can do it as aggressively as we want.
Is it still called the Twitter Corporation?
It's still twitter.com.
It redirects
Yeah,
there half the
works.
time.
It
So, yeah.
does. It's always Twitter to me. Like,
Yeah.
what do you, actually, I was hosting a public event and I was saying, oh, make sure you tweet out whatever. And I said, oh, is it tweet? Seat? What do we call it now? Post?
You just say a tweet. People know what you
I
mean.
know. Yeah. But like, what does Elon want us to say? What is...
I don't care. I don't really go posting there anymore.
It'll always be tweet to me, but I just want to know what...
I just get so confused.
Yeah.
I mean, X is such a horrible name to have picked because you can't turn it into something like you can't say, oh, I Z'd or whatever it is, right? Like,
terrible name for a terrible app.
yeah.
Which I live on, right? Like, I'm allowed to say that because I'm there all the time. So,
Yeah. I found it almost completely unusable, but I'll just go there to troll people now because that seems to be the only people on there now.
well, the problem is nothing's replaced it. Like, I know Blue Sky and Threads, but it's like, have they?
No, I get more engagement on Threads than Twitter these days.
Really?
So, yeah. So I
Maybe
think
I'm
that
missing
one
out.
has sort of, maybe not for everyone, but if you're a trans person, you talk about trans things, you get lots of engagement on Threads.
I just don't want to like rebuild another community.
That's the frustrating part.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I have a decent following on Twitter is because J.K. Rowling threatened to sue me.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'm proud of that, right? I'm like, I turned something horrible into, a platform that I can talk to people on. And so the idea of giving that up almost feels like she's winning. And so I'm like tied to this more than I probably should be.
Yeah.
So I want to take a moment to talk about how you each reach your audiences. I mean, we know that you both have podcasts and you've talked about some of the other things that you do, but what social media platforms or other platforms do you use and do you find them effective? And at this point, feel free to, promote yourself as well.
I mean, it was Twitter that I used to build the following for both podcasts, especially for Cambie Report, because we were tweeting so often in that election and talking about it. And there was like just a group of people during the 2018 election looking for commentary because it was a change election. And so we got the audience through Twitter and we posted a little bit to Instagram or Facebook, but never enough. Other than that, it was like organic word of mouth or just, we did a number of live events that were really cool because it's nice when you have a podcast that's very geography based. You can actually like meet your fans instead of like, a generic podcast about a movie or whatever kind of pop culture thing. Your audience could be all over the world. Yeah. And, we're going to do a live event. We have, 1,500 followers and they happen to just like be 20 per city. Like, it's going to be tough. Honestly, we stopped posting there, and because it's, part of my job is with social media and I just don't post it much. So we're not actually promoting either of them. So we kind of have a stalled growth pattern over a number of years. So we like pick up a few listeners every few months and we lose a few listeners. But, we have like a core group of patrons who donate monthly and we have them all in like a Slack channel where like that's most of our interaction. And that's really fruitful, but it doesn't really grow it much.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, back in the pure podcast days, it was all Twitter, because that's where people I found were in real time engaging with the issues that were being talked about on my program or my podcast. I've seen people try Reddit. I think Reddit's great too, but Reddit has a very healthy ability to sniff out self-promotion.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, how do I actually get this out there? I've seen people post the show on Reddit here and there, which is nice. But, obviously being on Check, which is a regional station, they push it, they have ads for it. It's in a good time slot. So a lot of that's being thrown over to them. But one thing I also do is I just ask the guests, and I'll happily do it for you as well. It's like, can you post about it on your socials? And most people are pretty willing because they've done your show or podcast or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so then you're trying to like piggyback off their following as well. And hopefully you were able to retain some of those listeners that you get over time. And again, you lose some over the course of a few weeks and you gain some. And I think it's certainly easier for me now because with Check, they're pushing stuff. With CBC, I'm able to say, hey, we're a podcast, go check us out. Like trying to get into spaces I can for that promotion. But it's not easy. Like it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. In my mind, originally, I had this idea of like, all I need to do is like be on CKNW and the podcast is going to blow up. That doesn't happen. Like you'll get a spot or you'll get an opportunity it never blows up. It just slowly builds with time.
Yeah.
And so just being patient with it too for anyone starting out, I think is so key. And the way you do that is you have to be passionate about what you're doing. If you're just out for fame or clicks, it's going to be hard.
Podcasts are so particularly tough, I think, because like if you're just doing like a blog type thing, you can have one post that goes viral and people will share it everywhere.
Yeah.
But podcast is like, hey, I need you to download an app that will download this MP3 file that's probably about an hour long, and I promise it's worth it.
Yeah.
And then you're like, I'm not doing that. And or someone's sitting at their computer listening. I don't know if anyone listens to podcasts sitting at their computer, but maybe it happens.
You'd be surprised the amount of people that tell me they watch our podcast on YouTube.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I really should put my shows on YouTube, but it's like, it's a long commitment, right? It's a higher bar to get people engaged. But I find once they are listeners, they're more likely to keep listening and be subscribers. So that's a really valuable audience to have. It's people who want to engage, and you get that weird parasocial relationship where people hear you. Like, I listen to a lot of podcasts and I'm like, oh, I know so-and-so. And like, no, I don't. I really don't know them. They don't know me.
No, that's so true.
But you build that connection.
Yeah.
You feel like you know them.
Yeah. And with our Slack channel, it really helps to like see some of the active people in there. And I don't agree with some of them. Some of them got wild opinions, but it's fun to have that like diversity, and no one in there is like so out there that I'm like, we can't ever be friends.
And then you're not in an echo chamber too if you have those people participating.
One of the things I started doing on the show, and we only started this a few weeks ago, was I started putting out my email, like obviously my This is Vancolour email at the end of the show, and just saying like, hey, whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear what you thought about the show. And so we'll get in, you know, a bunch of emails. A lot of it's just like, love the show, like really quick notes, which is always nice to read. But then you'll get like some thoughtful opinions. And like, I try as best as I can to make sure I write everyone in the same response that they had given me. So if it's a longer thing, and if it's comprehensible, if I can understand what they're saying, happy to write a long one back. If it's a short one, I'll just drop them a short note. But I think, trying to get it to ways to interact with your audience. And that could also be the comment section on a TikTok video. But I think interacting with that audience to create, if not a community feel, but at least like an interactive feel, also does go a long way.
And if you're interacting on social media, are you interacting as This is Vancolour, or are you interacting as Mo Amir?
I guess I'm just interacting as Mo Amir. Yeah, like I'll make sure, even on the emails, I'll make sure I side at Mo so they know that it's me that actually wrote back. Yeah, I mean, I think that personal touch, again, when you're at a level that it's still manageable, is worth it. And it's kind of fun, right? Because then you hear back from people, because when you respond to one email, they'll know that you respond. My favorite is when you get someone who is consistently like loves everything or the takes on the show or loves the guests. And then there'll be that one show where they're like, you know, I love your show, but I couldn't get on board. And I love it, right? Like, because that's the point. I mean, I think that's, especially when it comes to this kind of stuff, talking about current events or big issues, I don't know if I want an audience that necessarily agrees 100% of the time. I want them to be able to engage. I want them to give me feedback. Same way with the guests, right? Like you want some sort of diversity. So I think if you are starting a podcast or any kind of endeavor, don't feel like you're above interacting with the comments. Just make sure that you, and I've fallen trap into this as well, make sure you don't start internet fights with people in the comments section or engage with people who clearly are just trolling, right?
So I've run into this situation once where I invited someone to be on the podcast to promote their organization, because we've done a lot of episodes where we've had organizations on to talk about the work that they do to address social issues. And one person responded to me and said, thank you for the invite. I'm not going to be on your podcast because I don't like that you had X guest on before. Have you had that happen to you?
I've not. We don't have a lot of guests, so it doesn't come up as much. And I can't think of a controversial guest I've really had.
I mean, I didn't think I had a controversial guest, but...
No, I've never had that either. I would not. I would be like, oh, thank you for warning me not to talk to you if someone says that. Well, it's funny. I've had the opposite, right? I've had where it was a guest someone didn't like, and it's usually politicians, right? Like, this person said this on the show. I want to come on and talk to the other side. And I say, yeah, great, let's do it. You know, that's certainly more productive. But I think, anyone who kind of has that attitude, or even the attitude of like, what is this going to do for me? I just like, I don't know. Like maybe it'll go viral, or maybe no one will watch it. Who cares? Like that's, I think that those are red flags for me when someone is asking questions like that or making demands like you had that guest on a past show.
Right. Yeah. We're kind of getting close to the end of my questions, so
Okay, cool.
I'm curious to know at this point if there's anything we haven't talked about regarding commentating, journalism, that sort of whole sphere that you want to bring up.
Let me ask you a question. Ian.
Yeah.
Do you think we need, I think we both sort of agree that we can have more diversity in commentators. Do you think there's too many commentators?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at how post media has been going specifically, it's like fire journalist, but we're going to save these like gold-plated columnists who I think have terrible opinions that are all the same and I disagree with, but it's like there used to be journalists at National Post and they're the people who can go and tell the stories that then I can have an opinion about. I mean, like it's easier to have an opinion than it is to like do the hard work of going and learning all the stories. Like you filed FOIs as well. They're exhausting to try to get the information and to like
Be specific enough.
Yeah, to be specific enough, to be patient, to then like get a response back to be like, we need another 30 days. Is that okay? And you're like, wait, can I say no? I think I can say no.
At least it's not an ATIP where
Yeah.
you're waiting years.
Yeah, that federal government's awful. And so, like, I would never tell anyone to hold back their opinion, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, yeah, get out there, tell your opinion and share. But I think it's that we need more storytellers.
Okay. Yeah, no, I would agree with you. I would love to see more beat reporters, more storytellers, feature writers. And I would also agree and say that we have too many commentators.
Well, and our mainstream media really needs to invest more in journalism than in columnists and opinion. That's what I think, because they have the money and they've clearly prioritized because they know the columnists are popular.
Yeah.
People love reading Andrew Coyne. I used to, and then I realized all his opinions are just the same neoliberalism that I'm very tired of.
Right.
But
and that's where I was going with this, is that, you know, the number of commentators in mainstream media, I think is pretty good. Probably could use, I would actually say probably could use some more. Maybe the internet space or the alternative space has way too many commentators. I'm sorry.
it's just all it is.
Because it's easy to do, right? And I get it. That's how we started. And so I'm not shitting on it. I'm just saying like it's oversaturated. But I think in the mainstream media or legacy media, whatever you want to call it, I think we could use some more commentators, but they just have to be slightly different, right? So if we have, you brought up the National Post, if there's a commentator whose every piece is being critical about harm reduction or safe supply, then why isn't there the counterbalance to that of having a commentator who is solely focused on the toxic drug supply crisis, how people are dying, and what needs to be done on the flip side, right? So I just, in some way, I feel like the commentators in legacy media the space is quite narrow. And I feel
or
we
like
could
you
broaden
get the
it out
political
more.
panel and it's like, well, we have our New Democrat, our conservative, and
hate
our
that shit.
liberal.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, but there are different ways to think about it, and all your parties have a problem.
Well, and that's, you know, it's funny because Kyla Lee, past guest of this program, and we are on a political panel on CBC called Soapbox Social. And I remember when I pitched it, I said, listen, most current affairs or political panels are based on that party scheme. But what if we had a scheme? Because, you know, Kyla is probably further to the left than I am. But it's like, what if we had this scheme where you have these two progressives, but we're not coming from partisan lines? And we do disagree on a lot of things, but it's not on partisan lines, right? It's from different experiences, from different ideological views. And I think we need more of that. But the reason why you have a lot of political panels framed in the way that it is, where it's party and party, is because they're doing it for free. And they're paid to do it from their party or whatever.
Or from the consultant
or they're a
firm that
lobbyist.
works like 90% of the time for the
Exactly,
party.
right? Because people don't want to pay for informed political panelists. But I would love to see more political panels that are informed people, but really do not have a partisan tie. I don't care if they have an ideological bend. It's just the partisanship.
Well, and that was kind of the motivation for both my podcasts, was to have that, like, you know, find people who I don't 100% agree with and talk about politics, but not from a purely partisan lens.
Well, and you might think that I would disagree with that because my role on CBC was as a partisan guest, right? Representing the Green Party. But what I found really frustrating is the fact that neither the NDP or at the time, the BC Liberal, now BC United guest, they weren't able to speak their minds. Like we would have conversations outside of that room where they would say something completely different than what they'd said on the air. I didn't have that problem because my party didn't whip what I was saying.
Yeah.
And they would just have completely different personal opinions. And like, my party won't let me share my personal opinion. Whereas I could just say, this is the party stance and this is my personal opinion. And I think it does a disservice to the audience if the people that they're hearing from aren't stating what their actual opinions are.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. And so, yeah, it's an interesting question because I had this conversation with JJ McCullough. He's like, yeah, there are way too many commentators. And I'm like, yeah, I think that that question is complicated. It depends how you slice it, right?
Mm-hmm. And I like to end all of our episodes with a question around what our audience can do to help. And this is going to be maybe a challenging one to answer with regard to this specific topic of commentating in media. But do you see a role that the audience can play in trying to improve the media landscape, I suppose?
Absolutely. The first thing is find good journalism that you trust from whatever outlet and give them money. Subscribe to them. Every single independent media outlet that I've seen out there has Patreon or a subscription service. So like you could get, if you want just classic opinion, get the Globe and Mail delivered to your house. But I think there's better choices out there and there's better voices out there. But if you can afford to do that, it's worth doing. Like I support a couple journalists directly through Patreon, like Dustin Godfrey, who does great work.
Yeah, excellent. Great example.
But freelancing these days because they can't stay with they lost their job. So that's one simple solution. I would say share the good journalism you can find on the platforms that let you share it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a similar vein, I would just say, please, and I fall, victim to this too, where I don't do as much as I'd like to, but please follow local community news. That stuff affects your neighborhood and your life far more than stuff on the national level. And everyone is so focused on stuff nationally, and even worse, they're just like Canadians are focused stuff on that's happening in the US. And I get it. It's a lot more dramatic. You know the players, you kind of have an idea of it. But I just wish people engaged more in community news, in municipal politics. And it doesn't mean you have to do it every day. It just means you take a look at your local paper or outlet. It means that you know who the mayor is and who the councillors are and what their priorities are and what they're passing and what they're doing to a certain degree, right? Again, you don't have to be an expert, but I wish that people were just more involved and had a better interest in that, because that's where a lot of interesting things happen too. And in terms of what your neighborhood looks like, that's where that happens. So I do implore people, please support your local community outlets. They're all doing great work and they're shrinking, and we need them because they're the ones keeping people accountable.
Yeah, we all have a connection to the city of Coquitlam in some way, whether we live or work there or just pass through. But municipal voter turnout was like under 20% in the last election.
Really
freaking abysmal. Yeah. And the guy who is mayor, Richard Stewart, has been mayor for 20 years roughly, unchallenged. His nickname is King Richard, I was told. Like, that's not a healthy sign for a local democracy. Yeah. But yet, city council has a very strong opinion on the new housing legislation. I've been vocally critical about it. And I'm like, is this just your interest, or is this an interest that the community actually has? And I'm not convinced of that. But, they're likely to, the next election is likely to have just as bad turnout if people don't connect. So I don't know, subscribe to the Tri-Cities Dispatch. That's a good email newsletter. There's a lot of great startup newsletters doing journalism. We didn't even talk about that. At very least, follow some good journalism. If you can, give money to it.
Absolutely.
And tell your friends what they should be reading.
Yeah. Don't just post your opinions online.
Yeah.
Talk to people in real life if you can. Even the phone. It's a good medium.
A lost art.
Yeah.
And taking a page out of Mo's book, if you have thoughts on today's episode, you can email me at nicola@flagshop.com. This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING. I've been joined today by Mo Amir and Ian Bushfield. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a social justice podcast hosted by NICOLA SPURLING, brought to you by The Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book.